one of the things that I'm very passionate about, and I'm going to talk a lot today about medical device innovation and some of our programs, but what I'm passionate about is that we make innovations that have a real and tangible impact on patient care. And so about 6 years ago, we moved our entire engineering team into our regional hospital to ensure that all of our engineering innovations would have that impact on patient care. So I'm delighted this morning that I'm speaking to clinicians and that we're having this talk in a hospital. So over the next 30 or 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the innovation programs that we run, but I'm going to begin by just talking about the why. So why are we interested in innovation? So about 15 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I was developing a medical device for breast cancer detection based on microwave imaging. And I just received a large national grant, and one of the things I was really conscious of during that grant period was that we would take the device that we were developing and get it into the clinic and start using it with patients. And so the first thing I did in that project was we looked at groups in the US and Europe and in Asia who were developing microwave-based medical technologies. And at the time, there were 200 researchers working on microwave-based medical devices. Out of that 200, only 6 had ever tested their device on a single patient, and only 1 had ever sought to commercialize the technology. And if we consider the millions of euros of research funding that was going into this research, there was a real translational problem. So there was a real problem getting engineering and scientific innovation into the clinic. And I felt at the time, if I'm getting funding for this research, I need to ensure that this funding has an impact. So since then, as mentioned, we have moved our medical device lab into the hospital, and we engage with clinicians and partner with clinicians on every research project to ensure that our engineering breakthroughs result in clinical impact. So I've gone back and retrained in clinical research. I also have been working on medical device commercialization for the last 10 years. So that's my personal motivation. In terms of the national motivation in Ireland, we are a small country on the western edge of Europe, but medtech is a core pillar of our economy. So I think it's not well known, but Ireland is the second largest exporter of medical devices in Europe. About 12.5 billion in terms of exports per year, which is about 13% of our GDP. So 80% of stents used worldwide are manufactured in Ireland. 50% of ventilators used worldwide are manufactured in Ireland. So it's a core pillar of our economy, and medical innovation is very well supported from a government perspective. So in the west of Ireland, where I'm from, we have 13 of the world's largest medical device companies. So we have Stryker, we have Abbott, we have Boston Scientific and Medtronic. There are 38,000 people employed. Across the West Coast, there are about 350 medical device companies. But a statistic which is not often mentioned is 72% of those are indigenous Irish companies. So we tend to focus a lot on the multinationals, but actually almost 3/4 of our company are Irish formed and Irish managed. In terms of what supports are available, we have a number of research centres, and these are essentially groups of scientists who are developing technology that feed into new innovations in medtech. So we have Insight, which is a national centre for data analytics. We have Curum, which is a national centre for dedicated to medical devices. Amber is a national centre on biomaterials. And essentially the companies that are in Ireland leverage expertise from these research centres for their next generation of devices. For startups, we have a uniquely positive ecosystem. So a startup company in Ireland typically gets 2 years of seed funding. They also get incubation support and mentorship and guidance. So I'm presenting this as a very positive case. I'm presenting it as something that's very sustainable. But about 10 years ago, I was at a talk by a man called Ian Quinn from Craigana. And Ian is one of the leaders of medtech in Ireland. And he was talking about his concerns for the sector and the sustainability of the sector. And he talked about how in the 1970s and the 1980s, Ireland was leading the way in textiles. So at the time, textiles accounted for about 10% of all Irish exports. We had hundreds of indigenous Irish companies. We had multinationals and we had SMEs. So a very similar situation to where we are now in medtech. And then over a 10-year period, so from about 1975 to 1985, the entire industry essentially evaporated. So first, the multinational corporations left because of increasingly attractive economies in terms of cost in Asia in particular. And then after the multinationals left, the SMEs quickly followed. And this had a huge economic and societal cost. So when I was growing up in Ireland, you would often switch on the television in the 1980s and the 1990s, and you would see news stories of the latest factory closing down in the west of Ireland, several hundreds of people becoming unemployed. So when Ian gave this talk about 10 years ago, he was saying we cannot rest on a successful sector. We need to constantly reinforce the sector. So this was his strategy. One was that we became R&D partners with multinationals, but more importantly that we create more indigenous startup Irish companies and that we scale those startup companies. That we train the next generation of medtech developers and create a common language of innovation. So we start talking in innovation language that everyone understands. But I think the key point that he made was to create a virtuous circle. So that is that we bring together healthcare, we bring together academia and industry, and through those three partners, we feed each other through innovation. So that is a clinician with an idea for a new medical device can engage with academia, but can also engage with industry, and we can develop new innovations through this virtuous circle. So this is what he was trying to do. But one of the things that I said, one of the key slides which I'm going to present today is about how difficult it is to develop medical devices. So before we start any medical device or medical innovation program, we talk about these three problems. So the first one is developing a medical device startup is akin to any other startup with just many more ways to fail. So it's an extremely difficult process. The second one is this statistic that 75% of venture capital funded medtech companies fail within the first 5 years. So these are not campus-based startups. These are not an engineer with an idea. These are people who've raised significant funding already through venture capitalists. But again, 75% fail within the first 5 years. And the third one is important to consider from both an academic or from a clinician perspective, is that the average cost of getting a medical device to market is about $9 million. So that funding typically isn't available through clinicians, it isn't available through academia. So at some stage we need to engage with investors. So what I'm going to talk about a lot today is how do we engage with investors, how do we ensure that the technology that we're developing can raise enough funding to get to the patient. So going back to that first point, why are there so many different ways to fail in medtech? And these are the kind of additional challenges of medtech. So one is the funding requirement. So for a normal startup, you don't need 9 million to get to sales. For a normal startup, you don't have to worry about a lot of the regulatory standards that are required for medical devices. For a lot of startups, intellectual property isn't such a big concern. For a lot of startups, you don't have to spend 3 to 4 million euro on a clinical trial to show that your technology is effective. For a lot of startups, the customer pays for your device. In medtech, typically, the customer isn't paying for your device. It's an insurer who's paying for it, or the government. So that creates an extra challenge in terms of getting paid for your technology. So what I've presented for the first few slides is how difficult that is. And now I'm going to talk about how do you actually innovate in this environment, and how do you ensure that you make impact. So if you look at the US and Europe in terms of successful medtech ecosystems, and part of what we did in Ireland when we were looking at how to create an ecosystem was going to cities like Boston, going to cities like Chicago, going to San Francisco, and understanding how they work. And typically the kind of common thing that comes through is that you need really good people, so you need human capital, you need access to funds, and you need a very strong mentor network. And so this is common everywhere. And if you go to Chicago and you go to their accelerators, you'll see, or you go to San Francisco and look at their medtech accelerators, you'll see this pattern, which I call the survival of the fittest pattern. So they start an accelerator, and it's based in a large urban center where they have a strong medtech culture. They open an application for clinicians with ideas or engineers with ideas, and they say, if you have a commercial idea, come to us and we'll assess it. They pick the top 2 to 3%, and they select them based on essentially the commercial potential of the product, also on the team and the stage of development. But the key thing here is, because they're selecting that top 1 to 2% or 2 to 3%, they're getting really high quality commercial projects coming in. They accelerate them for 6 months to a year, and then they get really good startups coming out. So a part of me thinks accelerating really good companies is not that difficult. But if we were to take this model and implement it in a smaller city, like Galway, where I live, we would have a different outcome. So where I live in Galway is a small city of about 100,000 people. There is a really strong medtech culture. But if we were to open a call like they do in Chicago or Boston, we might get 30 clinicians or 30 engineers or 30 startup companies that were interested. We could select the top maybe 1/3 of that cohort. And just by having a smaller pool of people and a smaller group of innovators, we tend to get lower quality coming in and lower quality coming out. Now, the problem is, once these companies come out, they're all competing for funding with each other. So we're competing with US-based companies, we're competing with Asian-based companies. So if we were to follow this model, we would have a difficult time. And if you read all of the literature about medtech ecosystems and developing a culture of innovation, they talk about predictors of success. So there are 4 main predictors of success. And I've mentioned some of them already. Access to capital and investors, mentors, the quality of the training, and having a large number of high caliber applicants and a low acceptance rate. Now, some of these we can improve and some of these we can fix, but we can't fix access to investors. That's difficult and that's a challenge, and we can't fix the number of applicants we get. So if we were to implement this system in relatively small European cities, like they do in the US, we would be starting at a competitive disadvantage. So we didn't. Instead, we took an alternative approach. which is we have a number of innovation programs which I'm going to talk about. One is called the BioInnovate program, and the other is called the Health Innovation Hub Ireland program. And they're about hearing the investor's voice in the project at a much earlier stage. And so we only bring forward projects where we're almost guaranteed they're going to secure investment. So we can get that €9 million to get from an initial idea into the clinic where it can improve patient care. So the method we use in the BioInnovate program is called the Stanford Biodesign program. So the BioInnovate program is the only European affiliate program of Stanford Biodesign. But each year we hire 12 high caliber candidates. So these are not graduates, these are people typically in their 30s, people with families, people with mortgages, but very driven people. We bring together teams of commercial specialists, engineers, and clinicians. So every team has a clinician, every team has a commercial person and an engineer. Each year we pick 3 clinical themes. So one year we might pick cardiovascular, we might pick oncology, we might pick obs and gynae. And then we put our teams in the hospital, like this hospital, for 3 months, and we call it clinical immersion. And so what these teams do, we have a team, 4 teams of 3. They will follow a doctor around for 3 months. And they do what's called clinical observation. They write down any problem encountered by the clinician during that 3-month period. So anytime there's an inefficiency, anytime a procedure isn't optimized, anytime there's a delay in patient treatment or diagnosis. So after that 3-month period, they typically have a list of 1,000 clinical observations. And for me then, the really interesting part is they come back into the university and start filtering these problems. And they start saying which one of these 1,000 problems that we've seen in the hospital would have the biggest impact if we fixed it. Which one has the highest prevalence, the highest incidence amongst patients? Which one has the biggest potential market size? Which ones require a large clinical study? Which one only require a small clinical study? And each week they have to pitch their filtering. They have to tell us how they're filtering and why they've eliminated or why they've highly ranked a particular need. And we quiz them on that. So we challenge them in the way an investor would challenge them. So in November, they go from 1,000, a list of 1,000 problems, down to 200. In December, they go from 200 down to 20. And then they start really researching the final 20 problems. In January, they go from 20 down to 10. All of the time, they're technology agnostic. They don't think about the solution yet. They just say, is this a problem that's worth solving? And if we solve it, is it investable? When they get down to 10, in February, they go from 10 needs down to 1. And I think the important thing is, if I presented a list of the 10 to you now, you would probably say each one of them is a viable business. But they get down to that one need which has the biggest impact, and they start engaging with the university and looking for solutions to solve that problem. So once they've done that, now they have a really well-validated clinical need. They have an engineering solution. So what do they do next? They go back out and they talk to the doctors again. They go out to clinicians and say, okay, so this was a problem which we saw in September. We have this solution. Does it work? Would you be happy with this as a solution? They talk to KOLs, key opinion leaders, so doctors who are leaders in a particular society, but they also talk to doctors who are in the field, doing the procedure day to day. Will this device fix the problem for you? What are the issues with our solution? Is it good enough? They check whether there is IP. They check the regulatory pathway. So will it take 2 years to get regulatory approval in the US, or will it take 5 years? They talk to clinical trials facilities and they say, how much will it cost to show that this device works? And they also talk to investors and they say, if we build this, would you invest? And also, what evidence do you require to trigger that investment? So how far do you want us to take the development before you'll invest in our device? So this is what we're doing, and essentially what we're trying to do is, and I discussed this earlier, we were trying to take the risk out of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is seen as something which is reserved for high-risk individuals, people who are very business savvy. We are training clinicians and engineers and commercial people to do this in a very systemized way. Follow this pattern and you will get an investable company. So one of the first companies, the first year of BioInnovate, we had a company called Embo, which was developing a device for embolization. They originally got 3 million of funding in their seed round, and then in 2015 were acquired by C.R. Bard for 42 million. So again, I think because it worked, because we had such very early success, the program started getting a lot of momentum. A lot of investors wanted to get in early to see these devices. So since then, we've had diagnostic companies. Kite Medical are a company that are developing a solution to detect VUR in children, urinary reflux from the bladder to kidneys in children, non-invasively. We have companies who are developing cardiac ablation devices. We have companies that are developing novel diagnostics. But we are a small program, so it's 3 to 4 startups per year. But the quality coming out is very high, and I'll talk about what we mean in quality towards the end of the presentation. So I say this to everyone, my background is not commercial. So I am a trained engineer, retrained in clinical research, knew absolutely nothing about medical device commercialization. But for the last 10 years, I've been working with these companies. I sit in on their investor meetings. I sit in on their meetings with regulatory, with clinical trials, and you get to understand patterns. You get to see what a successful commercial company looks like. So I've just kind of summarized some of the learnings from that. So what we've seen is that medtech success is not a meritocracy. So this is what I say to a lot of the fellows each year. So what the accepted wisdom about medical device commercialization is that you identify a problem and a solution. You should be determined and single-minded. Anyone who tells you you can't do it, you should ignore them. And that if you have a good team and hard work, you will get success. So this is probably what I thought at the start. This is not true. Unfortunately, it's not true. So what actually happens is the companies that succeed identify lots of problems, but they only bring forward the ones, that top 0.1% of problems where there is real market pull. The companies that are successful are always able to pivot. So if they're developing something and then they realize, okay, the commercial potential isn't there, or the regulatory pathway is too long, they move and they pivot. They don't shy away from the naysayers. You don't shy away from people who are telling you this won't work. You actually engage with them, you understand their concerns, and then you reassess if your device is still possible. But the real thing is that the projects that are successful have strong market pull first, then a good team, and then good work plus hard work equals success. So it's not enough just to have a good idea with a good team and hard work. You need to have strong market pull. So the way I describe it is, and I really like this quote from Abraham Lincoln, which is, if you have 8 hours to cut down a tree, I'd spend the first hour sharpening the axe. What I mean by that is, if you're going to spend 10 years with a medical device company and put all of that effort into it, spend a lot of time making sure that that if you do your part well, that the company will be successful. The second thing which, as an engineer or a clinician who's interested in medical devices, that I would want to know is that you understand the risks of a project or a technology. So there are, as mentioned earlier, there's lots of risks associated with the technology in terms of market, the competition, clinical, regulatory, intellectual property. But from talking to investors a lot, what you realize is the market will only tolerate so much risk. So what I say to my fellows each year is, imagine risk as a currency. You can only spend a certain amount of it. So if you have a big technology risk, so if you're not sure your technology will work, so it's a big technology risk, you can't afford to have a big market risk as well. You can't afford to have a big clinical risk. If you have a big clinical risk, you can't afford to have a technology risk. So it's important that you know where the risk is in your project. So again, I'm always trying to summarize in my mind what the learnings have been, but one of the key learnings for me was in terms of whether a project is feasible. And this is, I suppose, being an engineer, I always think in terms of equations. The probability of being funded is largely a function of this ratio: the size of your addressable market over the cost of getting to market. So if you have large costs, if you have a big clinical trial to do, you can only get that funded if you have a large enough market that will attract investment to fund that clinical trial. So often because I work in the hospital, and we will often get clinicians saying, I have this idea for a device and I want to bring it forward commercially. And I'm doing this equation in my head. I'm thinking, okay, this device is for lung biopsy. How many lung biopsies are there every year? How big is that market? And how long will the trial be to show that the device works? So I'm doing this ratio in my head. And if the ratio is good, we bring the project forward and we try and develop it. If the ratio is poor, we try and change it or look for another idea. So just to give you an example of a couple of projects that we would look at, and maybe ask the question, which one would you invest in? The first one is a device to treat atrial fibrillation in the left atrial appendage. So as an engineer, I work in ablation. So I have an ablation device. And I could say I'm going to use my ablation device to treat atrial fibrillation in the left atrial appendage. Or I could use my ablation technology to treat lung cancer using an endoscope. Or I could use my ablation device to treat small tumors on the adrenal gland to treat Conn syndrome, which causes hypertension. And so when we get pitched these ideas, we start saying, okay, so what are the risks with each of these projects? What are the rewards? And are they investable? So you critique every project. In terms of the atrial fibrillation, so I was going to actually ask you, would you invest in any of these? Would anyone invest in the first one? Atrial fibrillation. All the cardiologists probably will invest. Anyone interested in the lung cancer project? So this is an endoscopic delivered device. I saw one hand up. Anyone interested in the adrenal ablation project? So this is 15% of all patients with hypertension, they say, are caused by these tumors on the adrenal gland. Hypertension is a huge market. Maybe you'd be interested in those. So I'm going to talk about what are the positives of each project and what are the negatives. The positives are I'll start with the risks first with the LAA ablation device. Huge competition in the market. So a lot of the strategics are already doing this. But the biggest one is the cost of clinical trials. So getting this device to the market is a 40 million euro development life cycle, including the clinical trials. So if you were developing this startup, you would have to have you want to be very confident that you can raise enough funding to do the clinical studies. The rewards are doing an ablation device or ablation therapy in the US. The reimbursement rate is about 5,000 to 10,000 per device, per therapy. So you get a lot per device. The market size is very big. In terms of the lung cancer treatment device, the risks are the same device, the same ablation device used to treat a tumor in the lung. You get about €1,500 or $1,500 per procedure in the US. So the market size is automatically a lot smaller. The rewards or the positives associated with that device is that you have lower costs of trial, and they're rolling out lung cancer screening in the States at the moment. So there's going to be a lot more people diagnosed with lung cancer, so lots of companies are looking for new treatments. The last one's interesting because this, I think, is a really good need, but some of the risks are there's no reimbursement code for this in the US, so I don't actually, if an investor asks me what is the market for this device, I don't know. I could take a guess that eventually they'll give us $1,500 per device for treating these tumors, but at the moment I can't give a market figure. The rewards are that there's no competition on the market, and the hypertension patient population is huge, so this has a lot of potential. So actually we're developing all three. So some of these are, two of these are companies, one is a research project. We're developing all three. All three use the same technology essentially, but all of them have very different risk profiles. And so as an engineer or a clinician getting involved in any of these, it's good to understand what the risks are with them and what are the rewards associated with them. So I've talked a lot about BioInnovate, and then I'm going to talk about the Health Innovation Hub. And the Health Innovation Hub is almost an extension of BioInnovate. So we do 3 to 4 companies a year through BioInnovate, but we said we want to get out into the hospital, engage more with clinicians and healthcare workers, and have more innovation actually in the hospitals. So in Ireland, we have hospital groups in the west, in Galway, in the east in Dublin, and in the south in Cork. And we've essentially established offices in the, drop-in offices in every hospital. And we have teams of 3 to 4 people in every hospital who are there to support 2 activities. So one is what we call innovation in. So if a company has a technology which they feel can improve the health service, but they don't really know how to engage with the health service, they can go to the innovation in office and we'll help them, link them into clinicians, link them into the healthcare service. The other part is what we call innovation out. So if we have a clinician or a healthcare worker with an idea for a new technology, we will do a commercial evaluation and put them on a pathway to develop the solution. So we have a commercial evaluator who has founded numerous startup companies, has raised funding, and what he does is he will meet with, say in the hospital in Galway, he will meet with clinicians and he will assess the clinical need that the person is developing. He will, if he thinks that there's good commercial potential, he might link them in with a medical device company and look at a licensing opportunity. Or if the clinician wants to start, or the healthcare worker wants to start a company, then he will start them on that process and help them develop the business case. So essentially, these 2 innovation programs that I'm talking about, BioInnovate and Health Innovation Hub, are just finding good problems to solve. And then the second part of that jigsaw is we need to start developing solutions and building companies. So how do we move from this idea of, okay, we have really good clinical needs, and now we need to move to an investable spin-out company? So biodesign is really good for identifying the need, but building a startup is less well understood. So when I was working with these companies, and this slide is outdated, but I've worked with about 20 companies. And again, you start to see what triggers investment. So what evidence do you need to do? What activities should you do in your company to get investment? And there's typically three types of evidence: commercial evidence, clinical evidence, and technical evidence for your solution. So we, as mentioned, we have a medical device lab with about 45 engineers working with these companies to develop their solution. We're in the hospital. Every project has a clinical lead, and our goal is that we take our initial these companies and bring them through the lab, and they go out the other side and they get funding from private investors. So what we've seen is that you need to develop those three types of evidence. But what we've seen is there's much more weighting towards commercial evidence. And again, as an engineer, I would like to be allowed just to build the device and not have to worry about the commercial side of things. I work with clinicians, they're interested in patient impact and improving patient care and would not want to worry about the commercial aspect. But what we're seeing is that what investors want to know is what's the business plan, what is the market size, what's your pathway to market. As mentioned, the investability of a company relates to the market versus the cost to get to market. The last point is really important, and I think this is where a lot of companies struggle, is that commercially viable is not necessarily investable. So an investor, a VC investor, will see 1,000 business proposals and will fund maybe 10. And so they will not fund a lot of companies that are very commercially viable, but it's a competition. You need not only to be commercially viable, but be the most attractive in terms of investment to get that. But I think the important thing to say is that this is a pattern that can be replicated. So I'm going to, on my next slide, I'm going to present what we do with companies to get them from an idea to an investable company. And it's a pattern that we replicate every year. And so when our fellows come into the program, they don't know about medical device commercialization. They don't know about investment. They just know about the clinical need. But we give them this template and we say, follow this template and you will get investment at the end. And it's all about gathering those three types of evidence. So they come in with the need. This timeline, it's obviously a shortened timeline, but essentially what we do is over a 2-year period, we develop devices, we bring them through typically through acute and chronic animal studies. We file IP, we build an advisory board of clinicians who will, so we typically, within a company, we might have 3 key employees, but we build an advisory board with key opinion leaders, usually from the US and Europe, who can lobby for reimbursement if required for your device, or who can complete the clinical trials once you've developed your technology. We meet the investor 3 to 4 times over the 2-year period, and we try to have multiple investors who are interested in your project, and you try to negotiate the best terms for your investment. But I suppose the point that I want to make very clear is that this is trying to take the magic out of entrepreneurship and making it very systematized. If you have a very good market need at the start, the process of getting to an investable startup is very well understood. So these are just some of the companies that have come out recently from the lab. Origin Medical are building that left atrial appendage cardiac ablation device. So they originally applied for the Fast Track to Innovation grant to develop their technology and were ranked first in Europe. They secured about 3 million through the Fast Track to Innovation grant. When they spun out, they applied for the Horizon 2020 SME funding and secured about 4 million through that, again ranked first in Europe for that device. They are moving rapidly now towards their first-in-human patient study. Fire1 is a company which has secured about 40 million in a Series B investment, and we worked with them in terms of technology development. and getting through an acute animal study. Neurant Medical is a company which is treating rhinitis using a permanent treatment for rhinitis using a single-use medical device. Now, they raised $9.5 million as a spin-out company, which was the largest ever investment in a spin-out medical company in Europe. And I think what's interesting there is, I guess, just how competitive these companies are when they exit, based on the fact that we spent so long validating the market pull for this technology. So in my lab, we have groups of projects that we're developing. So each year we take in 2 to 3 projects that we're bringing through this systemized development project. EndoWave are developing the lung ablation device. They're now fundraising. Venari are a company that are doing a device for venous vein closure non-thermally. C-Sync are a device to treat endometriosis in women. Newest Surgical is a technology to prevent surgical site infection post C-section. And Synthesis is a company which is developing a technology for lung drainage. So all of them very diverse, all of them working in various different clinical areas, but they're following the same pattern to investment. So it's not a technology problem, it's almost a funding problem. And then finally, kind of the interesting thing that we are seeing now is, as an academic institution, we're seeing what's called the boomerang effect, which is companies that we have worked with coming back in looking to partner on new projects. So last year, the university secured about €9 million in investment from companies that have spun out coming back in to partner on projects. And I'm paid by the university, I'm a university employee. It's really important that the ecosystem is giving back to the university. So now that's coming back through research funding through the university. Because we're working with more developed companies, it means we need to upscale also. So these companies that are coming back in are interested in first-in-man studies. So that's a whole other level in terms of quality and regulatory requirements. They're also more interested in design for manufacture rather than design for testing. But I think it's going back to what I said at the start, that you create this virtuous circle. So if we are helping these startups to succeed and they come back in and partner with the university on these type of projects, we're all feeding into them. In Galway, what happens is me as an academic engineer, clinicians, all benefit through shared IP. Some clinicians will become co-founders of companies, some academics become co-founders of companies. And it creates this environment where everybody wants to deliver some sort of innovation. Just in terms of numbers, this is where we are at the moment. A lot of those numbers maybe aren't as relevant. We have trained 81 researchers to date through the BioInnovate program. And the top right-hand corner, we have 7 high-potential startups who've raised about 40 million. So these are companies which are now scaling. So this is important from a national perspective, that we're going from startup companies to more established SMEs. We're seeing more companies moving towards clinical trials, and that's something that I think is particularly difficult for medtech, in that it's a long path to trial, it's a long path to market, it's a 6-year process. But one of the metrics that I'm really interested in, and which we're starting to get to now, is numbers of patients treated with devices developed in the program. So we're starting to capture that metric. So we're going back to the very start of the presentation, we're starting seeing that impact in the clinic. And interestingly, lots of the new technologies that we're developing are more patient-oriented. So these are devices that are in the home that the patients themselves are using. So I think that's quite positive. So that really finishes my part of this morning, but I suppose the points I want to emphasize is, one is that for me it's a very rewarding research environment. It's really nice to work on research projects where you're confident that if you do it right, it can get all the way to the clinic. It's really rewarding to work on projects that ultimately could also be commercially successful. And it creates a very nice environment both for academics who want to be involved, clinicians who want to improve outcomes for patients, and also from an economic perspective where you're creating jobs. So thank you for your attention.